I'm Afshin Ratansi. Welcome back to Going Underground, broadcasting all around the world from the UAE. In a week of the 5th anniversary of the beginning of Britain's torture and incarceration of Julian Assange, we don't even need WikiLeaks to tell us that the US has lost its proxy war on Russia through Ukraine. Even US Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell has acknowledged Moscow's military success. With nothing to stop the war of attrition, Ukraine is down to using homemade drones to attack Russia, and according to Moscow, a Kiev-hatched plan with a Hunter Biden-linked company to carry out March's Moscow concert hall atrocity. Even the Amazon Washington Post reports Ukrainian President Zelensky, who has abolished elections, is quickly running out of options. The international community, readily trading with Russia, is meanwhile aghast at NATO nation military support for genocide in Gaza in this region. Former NATO analyst Colonel Jacques Baud was in Ukraine after the US-backed coup that kicked off the war in Europe in 2014. He led the Peace Policy and Doctrine Division of the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations and has just published Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, the Defeat of the Vanquisher and the Russian Art of War, How the West Led Ukraine to Defeat. He joins me from the home of NATO headquarters, Brussels in Belgium. Colonel, thank you so much for coming on. As I was saying, the international community more concerned with how they evade the NATO economic sanctions when it comes to Ukraine, if they're going to think about Ukraine, because clearly genocide in Gaza is the big story internationally. But just take us back to what you saw after the US-backed coup in Kiev in 2014 as a NATO worker, as someone who was on the NATO payroll.
Well, that's a special matter, in fact, because, as you know, I'm a Swiss colonel. Switzerland doesn't belong to NATO, and I was in NATO in the framework of the Partnership for Peace, but I had a position as head of a small unit dedicated to the struggle against proliferation of small arms. And in 2014, as NATO suspected that the Donbass rebels received weapons from Russia, I was in charge of monitoring that conflict. And in fact, I had two different. I went to Ukraine under different hats. The first one was under the hat of this. The struggle against proliferation of small arms, I just said. And the other hat was that because I'm also a UN expert on the rule of law and the reform of security institutions. And what happened in the 2014, 2015 is that the Ukrainian army, which was in charge of the repression of the rebellion, not just in the Donbass, but in the whole south of Ukraine. We have forgotten that after the abolition of the law on the language in Ukraine, the whole south of Ukraine, in fact, started big protests from Odessa to up to Donetsk, to Kharkov even, and therefore the Ukrainian army was involved. But the problem is that the Ukrainian army was composed both by Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers, and very soon the Russian speakers in the Ukrainian army just defected to the rebels, and that explains, in fact, why the rebels got so much weapons and so fast, because complete regiments and battalions from the Ukrainian army just defected to the rebels. And based on that, the Ukrainian government asked NATO to assist in a kind of restructuring of the armed forces and improving also all the matters of internal discipline and all that. And I was involved in that, and therefore I had the opportunity to watch the conflict from within Ukraine at that stage. And what at that point, what surprised me was the difference we could notice between what I could see in the field and what the Western media reported. In fact, we had a totally different picture as what was happening in Ukraine. By the way, all the protests that happened after the 23rd of February 2014, nobody talked about this in the West, and in fact, it affected strongly the whole security within Ukraine and the whole relationship between Ukraine and I mean Ukraine, I mean Kiev, and the different oblasts of Ukraine.
And you
So,
witnessed the
and that,
burgeoning
in fact,
sort of crypto-Nazism in terms of anti-Russian culture that was occurring even back then. Of course, we saw much more under Zelensky.
you know, the coup in 2014 was in fact engineered by a very small amount of individuals that were influential, though in fact those extreme right-wing ultra-nationalist groups, which some have named neo-Nazi, some were neo-Nazi, other were simply ultra-nationalist. But in any case, this was a very small group. The majority of especially in the armed forces, you had a lot of people who were just conscript. In fact, it was a conscription army at that time. And a lot of individuals, in fact, were not so keen in supporting the government, because this was the new government that emerged from the Euromaidan, as it became known. This new government was not elected, and all the Russian part, or the Russian part of Ukraine didn't accept the changes that were led by this new unelected government. And in fact, you had, when I was there in September 2014, that's the time when all the rebels declared the Republic of Novorossiya. And in fact, you had popular republics, not just in the Donbass, but also in Odessa, in Dnipropetrovsk, in Kherson. You had popular republics that were, in fact, created. Well, they didn't stay very long because the repression was very hard, and because the Ukrainian army couldn't manage that because of the presence of Russian-speaking soldiers. That's the reason why the government started to recruit paramilitary forces. And those paramilitary forces were, in fact, ultra-nationalist. They were the same guys who did the Maidan uprising, in fact, I mean, the second stage of that uprising. And those guys were sent to make the repression in the south of the country. And that became extremely violent. And that, in fact, you had in the south, I mean, Odessa, Kherson, Dnipropetrovsk, this, you had really massacres and all kind of
the horror of the trade union building, famously. But just actually, let's just quickly do a quick jump to today, because I mean, so your contention is that Zelensky is facing, if we just leave aside the $61 billion number that's being thrown around NATO nation arguable propaganda media, that Zelensky, in terms of getting the soldiers together, people in the south as well as the east don't want to serve. And people in the west of Ukraine even around Kiev, wouldn't serve a Zelensky-led army for whatever next the US proxy has in store.
Well, in fact, what happens is that since last year, I mean, especially after the failure of the counteroffensive in 2023, what you had is that you had a division within the armed forces. You had, and namely, you had General Zaluzhny, who became ambassador in the UK, by the way, and you had the General Syrski, who replaced, in fact, Zaluzhny as head of the armed forces. And between the two, you have a fundamental difference in the approach of the defense of the country. General Zaluzhny is a little bit more Russian, if you want, in his way of waging war. He's probably more interested in having more mobile warfare and using operational art in defending through mobile operations, while Syrski is on the same line as Zelensky, and he vows to defend every single square inch of the country. And this is where you have the big problem in the Ukrainian army, because the Russians never strive to try to get territory. The purpose of the Russians in intervening in Ukraine is basically to destroy the threats to the population on Donbass. That's exactly what Vladimir Putin said on the 24th of February 2022. And in fact, that's exactly what the Russians are doing. So the Russians are not trying to gain territory, they are just trying to destroy a potential. And therefore, the idea of defending every square inch of the territory, in fact, plays into the strategy of the Russians, because the Russians, they just destroy potential. They destroy individuals, they destroy equipment, they destroy weaponry, they destroy everything. They don't need to have big advance and big arrows on the map. This is not the idea.
But just because of his actions, you're not saying Zelensky's a Russian spy, presumably. But then on developments right now, though, there have been attacks on the Zaporizhia reactor in the past few days. The IAEA have even had to make a rare statement saying the whole of Western Europe wasn't about to be destroyed by poisonous radioactive gas, presumably. I'm not sure what he meant. But, you know, you make the terrifying observation in your new book that these HIMARS, kamikaze drones from the United States, the Brimstones from Britain, the firing is monitored by these NATO nations. Does that mean that they know the targets like Zaporizhia, the targets in Belgorod of civilians that have been happening in the past few days?
Well, that's exactly what this is not my observation. In fact, Olaf Scholz said that the Brits and the French were in fact assisting Ukrainians in targeting and making those the cruise missiles, especially the Storm Shadows and the Scalp missiles, which are in fact the same missile, but one is the British one, the other the French one. But in fact, the Western military is assisting in targeting for those missiles.
So is Russia too frightened? Russia too frightened of responding, given that we heard from Putin that if there were NATO troops in situ in Ukraine, there would be a response? We know there were from the leaked phone call in Germany that there are British troops there. I'm not sure, we were talking about Zaluzhny, what his role is there with the intelligence services at MI6 in London. Is Russia just too frightened of attacking the source of those who are targeting weapons at Belgorod and in Moscow?
I don't think so. I think, there are very small groups of individuals. We are not talking about huge battalions and things like that. You have just a few experts that assist. So it's probably, I have no idea. I don't know if the Russians know where those guys are and where they are able to in fact target them. But if they would be able to do so, the Russian would certainly do so. In fact, in January or early February, if I am not wrong, the Russians targeted a hotel in Kharkov, which was full of French soldiers, and in fact probably even personnel who assisted for the handling and maintenance of the anti-aircraft missiles that were delivered by France to Ukraine. So in fact the Russians are not afraid at all. As soon as they will detect them, they will destroy them. So that's for sure. Now the issue of Zaporizhia, as you mentioned, the problem is that
Okay, Colonel, we'll have to get back to the nuclear reactor. I'll stop you there. More from the author of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, the defeat of the Vanquisher, and the Russian art of war, how the West led Ukraine to defeat after this break. Welcome back to Going Underground. I'm still here with retired Swiss Army Colonel and former NATO analyst, Jacques Baud. Colonel, I rudely interrupted at the end of part one as you were talking about, what could be the end of Western Europe. Arguably this week it could have happened. The Zaporizhia nuclear plant and the NATO armed weaponry that went to attack it in the past few days.
Well, in fact, this is not the first time the Ukrainian tried to attack this power plant. And the purpose of that is just to provoke the Europeans to intervene in the conflict. In fact, this has been a constant policy or strategy of the Ukrainians since the beginning of the war. In fact, trying to have a kind of a no-fly zone or some kind of intervention from NATO in Ukraine. And now this is exactly what they are repeating, what they have done last year and the year before. They are just trying to provoke the intervention of the Western armies. The idea would be to create some kind of a demilitarized zone around the power plant or something like that. That would, in fact, prevent movement from the Ukraine side. That's the idea, and they have done that, as I said in the past. So they will probably try again this year, and because that's the only solution.
And it's clear from, you know, Lloyd Austin, the boss of the Pentagon with cancer, who went AWOL from the Pentagon recently. He was testifying, begging for money at Congress this week. Clear that it isn't even about Ukraine. He's honestly talking about how the $61 billion is more about the rejuvenation of the weapons industry in the United States and the industrial base than it is about anything to do with Ukraine. Why do you think the journalists don't ask about if it really is so important for U.S. security, pouring the money into Ukraine or weaponry into Ukraine, that why have they outlawed U.S. troops going to help the Ukrainians?
Well, I think it has never been about Ukraine. And in fact, the first strategy regarding Ukraine, and in fact, a strategy that describes exactly what we have seen in the last 2 years, was written in 2019 by the RAND Corporation that outlined a strategy with 6 points that in fact, outlined exactly what we have seen last one. And the purpose of that strategy was not to help Ukraine. It was to instrumentalize Ukraine, to weaponize Ukraine, if you want, to weaken Russia. And in fact, this was confirmed a few days ago by Josep Borrell, the head of the Foreign Affairs of the European Union, who said that this conflict is not because we love Ukraine. It's because we want to support the U.S. interests. So it's amazing that even a very high-ranking official of the European Union confessed that it was about supporting U.S. interests. By the way, in the RAND Corporation report or strategy of 2019, it is explicitly written that applying or implementing this strategy would cause to Ukraine the huge loss of territories, huge losses in personnel, and will force Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace. So we knew from 2019 that implementing this strategy would lead Ukraine to the catastrophe. Now, again, the purpose of the whole thing was to weaken Russia. Why to weaken Russia? Because let's say the center of gravity, I would say, of the U.S. strategy is in fact China, and the problem is that they wanted to prevent Russia to be a strong support to China, and therefore they had to weaken Russia. There is even in the State Department, there is an initiative, and you had, in the last 2 years, you had at least seven international conferences about this. It's about so-called decolonizing Russia. It's about dismantling Russia and creating out of Russia about between 18 and 32 countries based on the ethnicity of the different republics. And in fact, to completely dismantle Russia as a state. And again, one of the conferences even happened last year in Brussels, in the Brussels Parliament, in the Parliament building. So we are talking about something which is absolutely official, which is on the website of the State Department, by the way. So
but it hasn't worked out very well, clearly, because China and Russia are closer together. But
well,
you mentioned
absolutely. In fact, the opposite happened.
But you mentioned the RAND Corporation. People can watch on Monday. We have Morten Halperin, who wrote the RAND documents that were leaked by Dan Ellsberg, friend of this show, the late Dan Ellsberg, that helped stop the Vietnam War, alas, only after a few million had been killed. Why is it that when you talk about the RAND Corporation clearly explaining what the Ukraine proxy war was all about, it's in the public view, and yet the war is unstoppable Tell me about the fatality ratio, desertion rates. Why is it that when you quote that Rand Corporation information, unlike the Vietnam War, it doesn't stop this catastrophic war for the Ukrainian people tomorrow?
Well, in fact, even the Rand Corporation has written several reports recently saying that, in fact, there is no point continuing this war. The problem is that now we are in a problem of face saving, and both in the United States and in Europe. And don't underestimate Europe. In fact, for many sanctions, as an example, many sanctions that were applied to Russia were in fact made by the Europeans against the advice of the Americans. Like, for instance, sanctions about oil products, or even ousting Russia from the SWIFT system. This was it was advised by the Americans not to do that, but the Europeans decided to do it. So no, we are now in a kind of a spiral, if you want, and nobody has the courage to stop it. And we are in this kind of yes, a spiral of violence. Not violence, not yet, but the Europeans are, in fact, engaging to that. Listen to what Macron said. I mean, he's ready to send troops, even if his own population is against that.
You don't think that's going to happen, though, right?
They don't see any.
You don't think that's going to happen?
Well, I'm not sure it will happen, but the problem is that it's so irrational. It's almost impossible to say whether it will or will not happen, because we are no longer in a kind of rational. If the decision making in the West was rational, we would have stopped that last year, in fact.
Yeah,
or even
okay, but
before.
clearly, as the book makes clear, how they completely misunderstand the proxy war and what Russia's responses are to NATO nation policy. Why is it NATO powers are so convinced, maybe it's just Western European ones against the advice of Washington, that, say, the Ministry of Defense building in London or the counterpart in Paris won't be taken out by a hypersonic missile from Russia because the Russian Federation needs to make a point and say, look, just cut it out now. We've had enough of this.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what
in terms of continual provocation, like, as you said, Macron announcing the deployment of 2,000, or is it 1,000 now, French Foreign Legion to Ukraine in defiance of what the Kremlin and the Duma has been saying. Why are they so convinced that Russia will not respond to any of these NATO countries and test their so-called Article 5?
Well, Article 5 is probably excluded from that equation, by the way, because if France, for instance, sends troops, it's not based on the NATO treaty, but on a bilateral treaty, which in fact doesn't base on the Washington Treaty. So, in fact, and the Americans have said they would not send troops on the ground, and probably they will try to avoid that, especially because they are in a presidential election year, and therefore it was probably not be very wise to start a new war or to engage the U.S. actively in a war at this period. So the Americans don't want to do that. I think the problem and the concern I have is that the recent joint, or let's say, communication between France and UK, especially with David Cameron, trying to have kind of a joint type of activity in Ukraine in an effort to provoke the US to intervene. Because that could lead to a situation where the Americans had no choice but to intervene.
And you don't think Biden actually wants this 61 billion to go through? It would help him, because as defeat approaches for the NATO powers, he can then say it was the Republicans' fault that we lost another war after Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Iraq, and Yemen, and who knows else? Where else?
I think Biden would like to have those 61 billion for Ukraine. First of all, just emotionally, because I think this conflict for Biden is just a question of emotion. There is nothing rational in that. The problem comes probably from other parts, including within the State Department, because there are different opinions about this, and apparently even within the State Department, some individuals would like to stop the whole thing because it doesn't bring it. And by the way, even the Pentagon apparently would probably not be unhappy if this would stop, because everybody sees that this conflict is going absolutely nowhere. It's just reinforcing Russia, and it's just an additional embarrassment for the president, in fact. But the problem is that, again, I come back on this point. We are not witnessing a rational decision making in the West, and especially certainly not at the level of Biden. And even at Macron, even Cameron probably, and Ursula von der Leyen, and also the so-called New Europe. I'm talking about the Baltic states and Poland, where you have people who are so enraged against Russia that, in fact, whatever happens, they would be happy as long as it harms the Russians. And that's a kind of a desperate situation that we have, which is, in fact, concerning, because I come from a strategic intelligence background, and my own working culture, if you want, is that decision making should be rational and based on factual analysis on what's going on the ground. But what we have seen in the last 2 years in Ukraine shows that, in fact, no decision was really based on a factual analysis on the ground. It was based on assumptions and even on a totally false narrative. I mean, we for 2 years we kept saying that the Russians were losing the war. They had no ammunition. There are no tanks anymore. They had poor commanders. The soldiers didn't want to fight. Blah 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 blah. And today we are exactly in the opposite situation. We are just saying that Russia is about to attack the rest of Europe, has more weapons than the rest of Europe, has more missiles than the rest of Europe, and so on and so forth. So we are in a total contradiction with ourselves. And that, in fact, nothing that we have heard in the narrative in the last 2 years was based on any evidence. It was just based on even assumptions.
Colonel, we'll have to talk about Al-Aqsa Flood, the other book, hopefully when there's a ceasefire in Gaza soon. But Colonel Jacques Baud, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And that's it for the show. Our continued condolences to those bereaved by UK-US-EU armed bombing in Palestine, Lebanon, Yemen, Syria and Iraq. The new books, Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, The Defeat of the Vanquisher, and The Russian Art of War, How the West Led Ukraine to Defeat, are out now. We'll be back on Monday with the US official who worked for Obama, Clinton, Nixon, Johnson and Kennedy administrations. Until then, keep in touch via all our social media if it's not censored in your country, and head to our channel, Going Underground TV on rumble.com, to watch new and old episodes of Going Underground. See you Monday.